Hi, this is Miss McIntosh here to talk to you about your Hamlet essay question for the OCR paper, Poetry and Prose Before 1900. This is a very weird little essay, a very weird little bit of the exam. So as you know, for the whole exam, you're answering on Ibsen and Rossetti for one half, one big essay, but your Hamlet question is split into two halves. One 15-marker close analysis of an extract, and one 15-marker that's an essay on Hamlet. Now, as we discussed last week, you're not really familiar with what AOs you're supposed to be doing, and they're weird ones. The first one, AO1, 50%, well-crafted, well-argued analysis of the play. Don't worry, we're going to look at what that means in just a second. The second one has caused us some agony over the years since the spec changed in 2015, and that is AO5, interpretations, adaptations, and a range of analytic approaches. So it doesn't just mean here's a Freudian interpretation, here's a feminist interpretation, here's Kenneth Branagh's play, here's this or that. It can also be just showing that things are open to a range of interpretations. But as we'll see when we're looking at our two full marker examples that students did in 2018, there is some of that. Right, so your time to complete it, you've got, what, an hour and 15 minutes for the entire Hamlet side. So depending on how you weigh up that exam, depending on how quickly you do the extract task, you've got at most 30 to 40 minutes, right, to write a whole essay on Hamlet, the most interpreted play in the history of the English language, which can seem very daunting. And that's why it's useful to look at these and realize that you really only have time for about 5 paragraphs. A 5-paragraph essay with a clear thesis statement and crafted topic sentences. A thesis, antithesis, synthesis structure could work there. You know, you make one argument, then you say, however, psychoanalytic interpretation, you know, but you don't need to marry yourself to that, but it might be quite useful to think that way. One thing is that if you were doing this for an exam, which you aren't this year, they do try and not throw you, but force you to think creatively. They don't want to get essays sort of out of the tin. They don't necessarily want to hear your pre-rehearsed essay on action and inaction in Hamlet. And so they can do what they did the last time we had exams, which was throw us completely by asking a very, very unexpected question. And that was about comedy in Hamlet. Now, as you'll see, both of these essays we're about to look at got full marks, and they're from two very different sorts of students, which is why I've chosen them. So they're both outstanding pieces of work done in exam conditions. One of them is longer than the other one. One of them is by a student who got an A, but was sort of a classic B student who worked very, very hard until she got there. So she has revised and revised and revised. She's incorporated, she's really paid attention in class. She's done her research. She's incorporated it all. She goes through everything she needs to do, and she makes a very convincing argument. The second one is by one of those people who does nothing for a year and a half, and then in the exam turns out to be the most dazzling literary scholar who ever walked this earth, right? So they've both got full marks. There's no one way to get to full marks, but we'll see some real commonalities when we've gone through them. So first one, and this is the question. In the play Hamlet, the comedy always makes a serious point. Serious points. So this one's student A, the hardworking student who sort of doesn't plod, but goes through step by step what she knows she needs to do. Now, I've left up on screen the whole time the AOs, so you can remember where AO1, sophisticated familiarity with the play, well-written, incisive analysis of it, and AO5, sophisticated consideration of a range of critical and analytic perspectives and performances. And that will change, what I've written there will change as we go through. So this is, the student was called Katie. This is Katie's first paragraph. Hamlet, a play of revenge, foul incest, and foul murder, contains aspects of comedy through the character's speech, using polysemy, puns, and hyperbole to create light-hearted effects. However, under the comedic speech lie serious points, such as Hamlet's madness, brutal misogyny, and failure to act in avenging his father's foul and most unnatural murder. On the other hand, it could be argued that the portrayal of more negative feelings, such as sadness, depression, and anger, makes serious points, such as suicide and grief. Alternatively, whilst light-hearted comedy and heavy feelings make negative points, it could be argued that the most serious points, such as the purpose of life, and made through existential thinking and pondering. Now, like I said, this was a very unexpected question. The students weren't very happy. I wasn't very happy. And we can see both candidates having to think on their feet. But what it shows us when they think on their feet is that they're really familiar with the play, right? So even though there's no AO2 language analysis, Katie and Mardi as well, in the essay we'll look at afterwards, is very, very familiar with the play and is able to pull a range of little quotations that I hope you're building up from having discussing it. You know, revenge my foul and most unnatural murder, da 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 da, you know, like words, 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 very like a whale, my lord, just endless little Hamlet quotations that will help you build your argument with specific reference to sort of key aspects of it, difficulty of interpretation, the impossibility of saying whether or not Hamlet's mad, you know, all those sorts of things. So she's done that throughout. And you'll also notice that she's using some techniques, some language drawn from AO2, polysemy, puns, hyperbole, that you don't have to analyze, and there are no points for analyzing in this exam. But of course, you can use it to be discussing your detailed understanding of it. It absolutely is a function of comedy here. Next paragraph. Hamlet's comedic use of polysemy, seems, madam, nay, I know not seems, it is, with his mother Gertrude, could be comedic due to the intellectual play on words and use of double meaning with the verb seems. However, this satirical language characterizes Hamlet's iconoclastic, dissatisfied personality as a stereotypical malcontent who is unhappy with the world and social order after Claudius's usurped the throne and married Gertrude, with such dexterity to incestuous sheets. Thus, the comedic use of polysemy actually symbolizes Hamlet's disagreement with the world. This is also appropriately portrayed in Branner's film interpretation of Hamlet, with the use of black costume to symbolize the black humors of the malcontent. This can also be seen in Henry Fuseli's painting of Hamlet, His Mother and the Ghost, and Eugene Delacroix's paintings of Hamlet and Ophelia. Now, don't freak out if you don't know all those references to things, because every teacher, it's entirely up to them what they choose to explore. It's based on what we're interested in. But obviously, Katie was my student, and I'm really interested in art and literature, as you all know. She's been given points for that. See all those AO5s ticked down the side by the examiner. So how is Henry Fuseli painting Hamlet? You know Henry Fuseli from his last appearance on the Gothic side with, you know, The Nightmare. She is showing awareness and discussion of dramatic conventions, an awful lot of talk about the malcontent here, so understanding what that means when things are staged, how that helps shape meaning. Frequent direct evidence from the text. Again, that use of sophisticated AO2 knowledge. Polysemy is the fancy word for a pun, and that is Hamlet's core mode of expressing his malcontent status on stage. The fact that she's so familiar with the role of the malcontent showed that she's really familiar with like the history of revenge tragedy and how Shakespeare's using it, and audiences will interpret it, right? References to key stage interpretation there with the Branner film version, as well as analysis of that. And she'll do that again in a little bit, and so will Mardi, actually talk about how the meaning changes or is shaped by what actors are doing on their various stages, how their costuming works, because that's AO5, right? This is a play, it's a script, it's not a novel. And a play, more than anything, is radically contingent. It completely changes every time it's performed. It completely changes when it's performed in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. When it's performed, then suddenly, you know, foreign policy and fathers and sons and the question of whether or not Denmark will remain sovereign becomes a very, very different play at that point. It means something else entirely. So you're not just analyzing the play you've read in class, you're also thinking about Hamlet sort of mutating and evolving across space and time, depending on where it's staged. Next paragraph, right? Hamlet's comedic use of polysemy. We've just done this, haven't we? Oops, done that page already. Right. Comedy can also be seen through Hamlet's antic disposition of madness when he talks of a chameleon's dish and puts on a dumb show for Ophelia to convince her of his madness. The nonsensical speech and comedic representation of Hamlet, who looks so messy as if he'd been loosed from hell, can actually lead to more serious matters, questioning if he's actually mad. According to A.C. Bradley's psychodynamic interpretations, Hamlet is a manic depressant who he diagnoses with mental illness and believes is truly mentally impaired. Signs of eccentric madness can also be seen in David Tennant's contemporary film interpretation, 2009, where Hamlet is shown through a long shot curled up in a small ball during his first soliloquy. Thus, his physically incapacitated state infers, implies, monster, true mania, not madness with method. So again, reference to core critical interpretation, you should know Bradley, right? Bradley is the critic who, in the early 20th century, starts treating Hamlet like a real human boy who's a real psychological subject and puts him on the couch, right? And diagnoses him with manic depression, what we'd now call bipolar disorder. And that's a distinct turn in Hamlet criticism. We then have the incredibly Freudian reading, and that all goes into the 1948 Laurence Olivier production. So you don't need to know every specific interpretation that any particular student mentions. Again, it's all completely dependent on what your teacher's interested in and what your teacher's passionate about. But that turn to treating Hamlet as someone with a diagnosable mental illness, that's a huge part of early 20th century interpretation. And there, again, you know, analyzing the effect of the staging. That's absolutely as meaningful as analyzing the words you read on the page, analyzing the words you saw spoken on screen and how meaning was being shaped in them. However, it could also be argued that his less light-hearted feelings in the play make serious points. For example, Hamlet is portrayed to be suffering extreme melancholic sadness. I have lost all my mirth, which fits with Richardson's interpretation of Hamlet as a sensitive and incapacitated character. That's another reference to an interpretation. In his sadness, he views the world negatively as a congregation of pestilent vapors, so negatively that he wishes for suicide, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt. Thus, as Hamlet's expressions of sadness lead to thoughts of death for him, this shows comedy is not the only element that can make serious points, right? As Katie is struggling a bit with the question here, because it was a really pesky question, but she's doing a good job of exploring things. Overall, whilst comedy and sadness can both lead to positive points, it could be argued through romantic interpretations such as Schlegel and Coleridge that Hamlet has a tendency to philosophize and meditate and loses himself in labyrinths of thought, and it is this existential thinking, to be or not to be, that leads to the most serious points, the purpose of humanity and existence. So again, several critical references there, right? Again, if you went to a training, OCR would tell you that, well, AO5 interpretations, it can be anything. It can be what Maria or Yash said in class. But at the same time, what they're rewarding here is understanding the critical tradition and the kind of big understandings of Hamlet interpretation. So the one she's referenced there at the end, Schlegel and Coleridge, is the romantic turn in Hamlet, where until the end of the 18th century, until Goethe, which is spelt in a really interesting way I won't bother you with now, no one really noticed that there was an issue of delay in Hamlet. Seriously, it was never discussed when people discussed it. That was not an issue. They discussed other things. And then we have the romantic turn, where Hamlet becomes a man of thought in a world of action, where this urge to philosophize and meditate becomes his overwhelming hamartia. Even the idea that he has a hamartia is relatively recent. And we end up in 1948 with Laurence Olivier's version, where he inserts a line at the beginning. This is a story of a man who could not make up his mind. Well, you have to make it be that story. It's not necessarily that story until, 1800. All right. So we're going to look at Mardy's. I'll go through this one a little bit more quickly. Mardy writes like an absolute angel, but at the same time, he's not just making bricks out of straw. You'll see there's the same sort of broad and sophisticated and then detailed familiarity with the text, with performances, with interpretations. That means you too can bash out an essay in this very concise short form and get a really high mark. So this is another 4 marks essay. Let's look at this. So Shakespeare employs comedy and wit to express, deconstruct, and explore concepts. Frequently, his comedy carries serious undertones, but perhaps he is actually using comedy to make light of these serious points. I can't read that critic's name, said, Ophelia has no story without Hamlet, suggesting that her character is essentially for Hamlet's use. He's a malcontent in the story of a man who could not make up his mind, the opening lines of Olivier's film adaptation, is constantly questioning and entertaining thoughts, so Ophelia is simply another thing in his story to prompt his exploration of various points and ideas. So, in one conversation where Hamlet jokes about female sexuality, discussing country matters, a pun for cunt, where the audience may laugh at his wit, Ophelia's visible discomfort in relation to Hamlet's questions causes an awareness of patriarchal oppression of women and male objectification of them. However, it is arguable that the nature of Hamlet is an unstable text, implying contingency in its meaning. Therefore, any allusion to serious issues is dependent on how each audience member ascribes meaning to the play. That is such an important point, isn't it? So you'll see, I think he might say it here as a quotation I give my students: every age constructs the Shakespeare or Shakespeares that it needs. I think is a Terry Eagleton line. But Mardy is very aware here of Hamlet as a completely mutating text. That you can't really say, well, the audience will see this and do this, because you have to talk about the performance, the audience, the specific context, right? My favorite line of his essay coming up. Hamlet is a frame with no painting. The comedy, wit, tragedy is built into its framework, but the colors of its painting, the meanings behind these core building blocks, are drawn by whoever consumes them. So Mardy's arguing that that Hamlet is always dreamt into being by the audience, by the director, by the play. And those serious points may be derived from comedy and something, jokes. One may argue there are instances where Shakespeare explicitly uses comedy to make serious points. When two gravediggers in Act 5, Scene 1 discuss life and death, singing songs of and making jokes, the serious points here are undeniably expressed using humor, but arguably it's not the comedy making serious points, but the seriousness of the point is blunted by using comedy. Hazlitt said, "It is we who are Hamlet. It is we who live and laugh, and it is we who feel emotions." Hamlet displays a range of emotions, attempting to perform essentially us. So when humor and laughter is mixed with death and seriousness, it's a reflection of Hamlet's role as a reflection of all people. Since he is performing all of us simultaneously, and because we interpret the play differently, sorry, I will tell you what I think about this in a minute, contingent in meaning, comedy and serious ideas will inevitably be expressed hand in hand. However, interpretations of Hamlet, namely Tennant's BBC version, maintain a bleak, serious tone throughout. Therefore, comedy in these versions never makes serious points, for the serious points are expressed seriously. Laughter is related to madness, and madness sets a deranged and intense mood. Consequently, if comedy in these interpretations is present, it's expressed with seriousness and no humor. In conclusion, comedy in Hamlet is given serious meaning when the audience ascribe it. If it is received as only humor and no thought, then it does not express these points always. Alternatively, comedy may be seen as simply a tool to make light of serious ideas, meaning they are not derivative, but explicitly expressed with humor. Right. A lot of that, Mardy is blagging, but he is blagging beautifully, isn't he? There's some fuzziness in the middle where I thought he was going to lose the examiner. But if we look at where he's been given marks, 5, 5, 1, 1, 5, 5, 5, 1, 1, 1, that range of interpretations, the idea that fundamentally Hamlet is a contingent, unstable text whose meaning is endlessly created by its context, its audience, the social fashion for interpretations of Hamlet. It's a really core observation and really at the heart of his essay. At the same time, even though Katie has all of that same sort of information, that rich understanding of the history of Hamlet criticism, she's not written her essay in such a difficult way, has she? She's sort of done a more straightforward thing. But I thought it would be useful to look at 2 full markers. Right. So there will be an accompanying application that goes through the history of Hamlet criticism, the sort of basic big steps. So your romantic Hamlet, your Victorian Hamlet with its obsession with Ophelia, then your Freudian Hamlet, your Bradley Hamlet, and then your new historicist Hamlet, your feminist Hamlet, your post-colonial Hamlet. But for now, what I'd really like you to have a very solid idea about is what you're required to do in a Shakespeare essay for OCR, how short it has to be, and what it should look like. And the answer is there's a range of things it can look like, but it has some things in common. Knowledge of the history of interpretation, knowledge of several key performances, and you can pick those yourself, and yeah, a very clear sense that the play is almost impossible to pin down. Right. Thank you, guys.